Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Fairfield University Alumni Career Webinar Series. My name is Julie Tizzoli and I'm from the class of 1985. I am the Manager of Employer Relations and Alumni Career Development. Our webinar today is Change Management, Stress, and Resilience. We've had a great response from alumni for today's webinar about coping with stress and change. The topic clearly resonates with so many of us. So thank you all for joining this webinar today. As always, our webinars are recorded and can be found on our website at www.fairfield.edu/alumni-career. The recording of this webinar will be posted within 1 to 3 business days. You can find all of our past recordings here at this website as well. So please take advantage of all these resources that are available to you. If you experience any technical difficulties, please email me or send a message through the chat box and I will try to help you. Dr. Maloney has a lot of valuable information for you today. If you have questions, please type them into the question box as we go along. Paul will save a little time at the end of his presentation to answer them. The question box is located in the control bar and will show up when you click on the Go to Webinar View menu in the upper right-hand corner. Also, please be sure to give us your feedback after the session. And finally, to make this session as interactive as possible, Dr. Maloney has 3 polling questions throughout the presentation. We hope that you all will participate. We'll let you know when it's time. So I am now very happy to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Paul Maloney. He's returning. He's done a couple of presentations in the past, so we appreciate him coming back. And he is the director of the Applied Psychology program in the Graduate School at Fairfield University. He teaches performance coaching, organizational psychology, organizational development, consulting skills, and designing training and development programs. He is a member of the American Psychological Association, the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, and the Organization Development Network. Dr. Maloney has consulted on organizational and human resources issues worldwide. His career includes senior level positions in management and organization development at the National Broadcast Company, NBC, Mobil Oil Corporation, and PepsiCo International. Over the last 25 years, Paul has consulted with American Airlines, GE, ExxonMobil, Chrysler, Wilson Sporting Goods, Perrier, Kodak, Covidien, Artisan Software, Gen Re, Greenwich Associates, and many other organizations around the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Maloney. Paul, I'm going to hand it over to you now. You there?
Well, thank you very much, Julie. I'm here.
There he is. Now,
thank you very much.
We had a little bit of technical difficulties this morning with the audio, so everybody, hopefully in the audience, we can hear you now. And Dr. Maloney, and if you all have trouble hearing, please hang in there with us. You should be fine.
We all set, Julie? Okay. Good afternoon, folks. It's great to have this opportunity to talk with you this afternoon about change management, stress, and resilience. We're talking about change, and of course change is one of those issues that we all have to deal with on a continuing basis. I was reminded of that the other day when I was reading an article and they were talking about the kinds of jobs that would be available, for example, in 20 years. And they were figuring that somewhere in the vicinity between 47 and 50% of those jobs have not even been discovered as yet. So obviously we're going through some significant change, and we have been for some period of time now. So today I'd start off our little presentation focusing upon a couple of key quotations. First one comes from Charles Darwin. It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. Secondly, you must be the change you wish to see in the world. So we're all in the process of change. In our jobs particularly, for example, in terms of what we have to deal with, the assignments that we have, the people that we're working with on a continuous basis. Now, before we get started on our presentation, one of the questions that I had for the group, Julie is going to do a survey for us on, and that is, what have you seen as far as change is concerned? So if you'd take the poll now, Julie, I would appreciate it.
Okay, think of a recent unsuccessful change initiative. Was it unsuccessful primarily because of, and just select one, leadership, the plan, communications, timing, or employees? So we'll just take a minute. Everybody, if you wouldn't mind getting to your mouse and click on one of the answers, that would be great. Good. Everyone's just waking up, just getting going here. Okay, this is great. I'm going to close it down. And share the results. So we have 43% say that leadership is the cause, primarily. 9% say it's the plan. 37% say it's communications. 6% say timing, and 6% say employees.
So it's the communication and leadership, typically, that are some of the key issues, and the plan. Okay. Well, as we talk about change and change management today, we're going to be talking about planned and unplanned change, as you'll see in our overview. We'll also be looking at stress, because oftentimes when people are going through the change process, what we're finding is that they're also experiencing stress, and how do we deal with the types of stress that we experience. Thirdly, change process. What are the individual reactions that people have to change? And then next, resilience. How do we develop resilience? And what is the resilience that we're talking about here? And what does it really mean for us as individuals in terms of being able to bounce back from one change to another change? And then we'll get into best practices and some guidelines to assist you in the change management process. So as we look at change, stress, and resiliency, we're under the bombardment of constant rapid change. For years, we used to go through change, and we always considered it to be an event. We'd go through the change, whatever it might be, a reorganization or something similar, and then that would be the end of it for a long period of time, and there'd be a plateau. Today, there's no plateau. We're constantly going from one change to another change to another change. During this period of time, what we're finding also, however, is variable leadership. And you brought the point out, for example, in the poll, that many times the leadership is not on top of the change or the change process. And because of that varied leadership, we're not accomplishing the results that we want to. It's been estimated, for example, in change programs, that somewhere in the vicinity of 60 to 70% of change management programs fail. They do not accomplish the end results that they were designed for. Many times that's due to the leadership. Many times it might be due to the plan or the communication, as we'll see. Of course, today we're confronted too with global competition, so things are constantly changing in the international market, having an effect upon our business and our processes and our competition. We're frequently told, do more with less, the cost containment approach, keeping our costs down while trying to achieve productivity on the one hand and profits. Communication overload. Everybody is getting bombarded with messages, whether it's from instant messaging on the one hand to emails to Skype, telephone calls, etc. And we're just overloaded with all of the communication. And some of the communication, obviously, that comes in across our desk, for example, is not information that we need to be participating in. For example, the average manager, it's estimated, gets somewhere in the vicinity of 180 to 200 email messages per day. So given that volume, it's tough to keep up. We have expectant stakeholders and shareholders who are constantly demanding results, results, results. So obviously everybody is feeling a great deal of pressure. Now, when we talk about change management, what we're really talking about is a planned and disciplined process to effecting a change in the goals, the culture, structure, technology, people, or management to increase performance with special attention to the human dimension. Now, when we talk about culture, for example, we're really talking about how do we do things in our organization. We know what structure is, technology, people, management. The human dimension always plays a role, for example, that we find in change management particularly, and perhaps a more significant role than many of you have anticipated. Change often induces stress, leading to a lot of different kinds of adjustments that we have to make. Obviously, we run into communication problems. Someone thinks that they heard a particular message, or they pick something up, for example, from the rumor mill, and that starts to spread through the organization. And that increases a lot of stress, for example, for people. Or we have personality differences that are exacerbated because of the changes that are taking place. And we're finding that people are feeling a lot less comfortable, for example, in working with one another. Or the work expectations change. Now we have a new way of doing things, for example. Sometimes people catch on quickly and sometimes they don't. So the expectations perhaps oftentimes don't fit what people are capable of accomplishing. Work assignments. What was anticipated before has all of a sudden changed. For example, when we have a change in our department or in our organization and someone leaves a job, frequently other people in the organization have to pick up the slack. So the work assignments become heavier and heavier and heavier, greater workloads, for example, and at the same time, fewer resources to draw upon. So we find that the change can certainly bring in a lot of problems for people. So one of the things that I'd like to do here is to take a look at the issue of stress. And I'm going to ask Julie to do another quick poll on stress. If you would handle that at this point, please, Julie.
Okay. Everybody, if you can take a look at your screen and please go ahead and answer. To what extent do you feel stress on the job? None, some, moderate, much, or a great deal? Okay, a few more seconds to get everybody in there. Oh, you guys did it so much more quickly this time. This is great. All right, I'm going to close it down and share it with everybody. Okay, so there's nobody here on the call that feels no stress. They feel, that's not surprising, right? They, some is 10%, 38% feel moderate stress, 36% feel much stress, and 15% feel a great deal of stress.
Okay. So I think we can see, for example, that because of all of the changes that are taking place, obviously stress plays a significant role in our lives on the job, for example, because there are so many different points for it to develop from. So as we look at the issue of stress, let's take a look at what stress really is. There are really two parts to stress. First one is what we call eustress. And as we see from the screen here, it's positive and motivating. Think for a moment as you prepare to do an individual presentation, and you're in front of your board or you're in front of your senior managers and you're going to make that presentation, and you can feel that stress in your body. But it prompts you to want to do the best that you can. So it's positive. It's helping you to adapt to what that situation happens to be. On the other hand, distress. Many people experience distress, which impedes their performance. So all of a sudden they block, for example, on something that would be routine for them. They're unable to do it. or they don't do it as effectively as they normally would. Now, this is based upon the work of Hans Selye a number of years ago. So what we see is that distress becomes a problem when people all of a sudden selectively perceive information. They pick out only what they want to believe or they want to perceive, as opposed to identifying all of the elements or all of the information they need to be accountable for. Other times they demonstrate tunnel vision. There's one way of doing things, for example, or one way of looking at things, and that's because of the degree of stress that they're experiencing. They may avoid others and fail to ask a lot of questions because they're not open to new ideas. Pressure is on them, and what happens oftentimes is we tend to close down as opposed to opening up. And so we rely upon the old way of doing things. In many instances, we see that people withdraw psychologically. They avoid the situation altogether, pretend that it doesn't exist. So what we see is that many costs all of a sudden start to increase when we're going through major change management types of programs, or we have a lot of changes taking place in our organization. Frequently we find that the number of accidents tends to increase. So safety becomes a real issue when we're dealing with change, major change in an organization. Absenteeism. Some people decide, I don't want to deal with this, and they avoid it. And so they're absent from work. In other cases, and we know that this happens very frequently when there's a major change taking place, we have a high level of turnover. And that turnover will frequently occur, for example, amongst the best employees. And so one of the things that we have to be careful of is to ensure that we're hanging on to the good employees, making sure that they don't turn over, they don't leave us during that period of time of change. We also run into diminished productivity. People's attention is split between oftentimes what they should be doing and what they are doing in terms of their performance. And sometimes this can increase medical costs. So what's going to happen when we have a change? The question for most people is, what am I going to do? Now what we find is that there are a series of phases of individual change. Some people have a reaction to it, such as shock. They're overcome by it. Others get angry because they feel it's going to change their plans, for example, or what they're doing. Others simply reject it and deny that it's going to have any impact upon them at all. Others accept it and step up to the bat, so to speak, and others look for help. So their perceptions are very different. In the shock situation, they perceive it as a threat. It could be a threat to their plans. It could be a threat to their family life. It could be a threat to their position in the organization. It could be a threat to plans that they've worked on, for example, in the organization for some period of time, and all of a sudden they're changing. With the reaction of anger, sometimes people have the flight or fight response, which is a basic human-animal kind of response. Take flight, and we avoid the situation, whether it's absenteeism or it's psychological absence. Or we fight, and sometimes, for example, during major changes, people end up getting into a lot of verbal arguments, for example, and it might be with a supervisor, it might be with a fellow employee, it might even be with a client. In other cases, it's a denial, and they're simply rejecting the change out and out. That's all there is. I'm not going to pay any attention to this change. It's not going to affect me. And what they're doing is basically putting blinders on. And then lastly, they move to the phase of acceptance. Well, I can understand things are changing, so I'm going to have to let some of these things go from the past, and I'm going to have to move on. And that's when they start to seek help, and they look for a new model, a new way of doing things. And they're looking for assistance and helping to guide them through the process. Now, what we see sometimes is there's the resistance to change, and it can be out-and-out resistance, for example. People will resist change because they prefer to stand still. They're afraid to take the risk. And people tend to become more risk-aversive, obviously, the longer that they are in a particular position or in a particular capacity, or they've been doing something for some period of time. And they're become risk-aversive to making any kind of a change. Others, for example, fear that they're not competent. Will I be able to handle this? Do I have the skills that are necessary to move on to this next level? Will I be successful? Others feel the ambiguity of change. And this is very difficult for many people, dealing with the ambiguity, the unknown parcels of change. And frequently people don't know what's going to happen with the change. Many times they're not informed in terms of what is going to occur for a variety of reasons. And it leaves them in an ambiguous position. And many people do not deal with ambiguity very well. They get concerned about the loss. And we're going to talk more about loss in just a few minutes. And lastly, they oftentimes don't see what potential benefits may be coming out. It's almost as though they're using the blinders here and don't want to see what the benefits are. Now, as far as loss is concerned, this is where it gets into an impact upon people. And it's really the social relationships. All of a sudden, you've had a relationship with somebody, you've had a working relationship that's gone on for a number of years. Perhaps it's 10, 15, 20 years. And now all of a sudden with this change, that relationship is going to go by the board. And you're going to have to develop new ones. And oftentimes when we think about relationships and we think about what we do on a day-to-day kind of basis, much of which we do is a habit. And now all of a sudden we're going to have to break the old habit and we're going to have to start instituting new habits. That takes time. That takes risk to some extent. In other cases, people are going to lose power and status. Frequently, those two go hand in hand. For example, if someone's position changes significantly, maybe it means that the size of their position and the degree of power that they have is going to shrink. It's going to be restricted. So all of a sudden, they have less power. They also have less status as a result. Or it may be affecting the degree of freedom that they have. Having some flexibility, having the opportunity to make decisions for themselves about how their position is going to be conducted, what they're going to be doing in their position. And then lastly, the old way. We all get very comfortable after a while in doing things in a particular way, going back to that notion of the habits. And now all of a sudden the old way is no longer the right way because of the changes that have taken place. So it becomes more difficult for many people. So what can we do to help people deal with stress then? Well, one of the easiest ways to help people resolve stress is to change the stressor, and that is clarifying job responsibilities. We have so many different things that we're supposed to be accountable for today, and it's not frequent enough that people go back and they analyze what was the job, for example, a few months ago or a year ago versus what it is today. What are the things that we can do today that we couldn't do perhaps back then? And what are the things that we cannot do today because we don't have the resources that we used to do? And frequently people don't go back and take a look at that. And as a result, the job gets ambiguous. If we can clarify some of the job responsibilities and be more specific with people, it helps to relieve a lot of the ambiguity and it helps people to understand what they're going to actually be held accountable for. Second thing that we can do is to change the emotion, reframe or revise our perception. It's similar, for example, if someone walks up to you and gives you 2 lemons, and you say, okay, I've got 2 lemons. So what do I do with 2 lemons? Well, somebody might suggest, for example, reframing that and saying, why don't you make some lemonade? So if we reframe how we look at situations, oftentimes it can make a significant difference. If we look at a change as not being a problem, but maybe it's an opportunity. What can I make out of this? And we'll talk more about that as we go along. Another thing you can do is to use muscle relaxation or exercise. And frequently when we're going through times of stress and change, people don't exercise sufficiently. Now, by muscle relaxation, it means tightening a muscle, for example, as tight as you can, like taking your hand and squeezing it into a fist and then letting it go. And you can just feel the relaxation in it. Well, you can do the same thing with other muscles in your body, and it helps to relax you, and it helps to reduce a degree of the stress. Other techniques are meditation and deep breathing exercises. For example, I find that many of the people that I coach on presentation skills don't breathe properly when they get up in front of the group. What they do is they take very short breaths, which are typical when people are under stress, rather than really having a wholesome, full breathing and taking in a good deep breath. They're taking very short breaths, and that increases a person's nervousness. So I encourage them to take 3 or 4 good deep breaths before they start on their presentation. And what it does is a couple of things. One, it helps to relax them. And secondly, it gets more oxygen into the brain. And when you have more oxygen, obviously you think better and you respond better. Next, avoiding caffeine and sugared beverages. And these are 2 of the no-nos anytime that you're under stress, because it will just help to increase your stress. Now, the last topic we have on this particular slide is developing resilience. What is resilience? Well, it's that ability to be able to adapt and bounce back. It's like that elastic band, for example, that you might stretch out and then you let it go and it goes back to its original size. It's the ability to recover from change or adversity, as we see here. Now, what we have found over a period of time, and this is based upon my experience in working with many different groups as well as what I've seen in the research, research shows that resilient people have a tendency to burn out less. They incur lower health costs, and they have a tendency to deal with problems more quickly and effectively. Now, does it mean that they are unaffected by change? No, it doesn't mean that at all. What it does mean, however, is that they have resilience, and many people have learned resilience, and it can be learned by others. When we look at resilient people, these are some of the hallmarks, we might say, of resilient people. One, they maintain perspective. They remain realistically optimistic. They feel in control. They scan their environment, and they use their sense of humor. Now let's take a look at each one of these individually. As we look at maintaining perspective, think in terms of the times that you've seen people experience a problem and their reaction is to blow up. They get angry. They take it out and abuse other people in their immediate environment. That's not maintaining perspective. What we mean by maintaining perspective is they stop and they remember that it's normal to have a reaction. But they recognize change as a constant and they accept it. And they focus consciously on the issue, the problem, or the opportunity. So what they try to do is to solve the problem as opposed to simply getting upset about it. So they try to come up with a way of dealing with the problem. They try to solve the problem, and then they investigate what actually happened afterwards. So you'll frequently hear them reframe something as follows. What is the worst case scenario? Change happens. I'm going to make it work for me. How else might I look at this? Can I reframe this? Or another approach would be, how would I counsel one of my friends on this? So it means separating yourself from that change and analyzing it as you would any other business issue or problem or opportunity, basically. And that's what we mean by maintaining perspective. Second one, remain realistically optimistic. Here again, people visualize what they want, and they expect things to work out well. Now, does that mean they're wearing rose-colored glasses? By no means. What they're looking at is, what are the real possibilities here? I can see this as a challenge which I can handle. So they focus on the journey. What are their gains? And what progress are they making? Now, there was an interesting book that came out a few years ago that was called Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania. And he found that people who tended to be optimistic tended to do better in sports, in school, and in business, based upon his research. So it certainly has an impact on people's performance. Third, they feel as though they're in control. They feel they have options. They've been dealt unforeseen events. They look at these situations, though, as challenges and opportunities where they can have some influence. So they're able to adjust to changing circumstances. And they're able to see the forest for the trees, so to speak. Their locus of control, their feeling of control, is inside themselves. They feel that they have control over the circumstances as opposed to the circumstances having control over them. Next item that we see is they scan their environment. And what we mean by this is that they're often able to anticipate events because they're paying attention to what's going on inside the organization as well as outside the organization. They get involved in organizational politics. And this is something that people many times tend to overlook. They don't want to get involved in the politics. And yet, anytime you're working in an organization, I feel that if you get two or more people together, you've got politics. So you've got to use your own influence and your personal power to make things happen. So people who are resilient have a tendency to use their social competence, and they develop personal networks internally and externally in the organization. And they listen to the rumor mill. And we'll talk more about the rumor mill a little bit later. But they get the facts. So they separate fact from gossip or fiction, so to speak. And the final thing that they do in scanning their environment, they have a tendency to hitch their wagons to lifelong learning. In other words, they're continuously learning and adapting to new situations. And then lastly, they use their sense of humor. They find humor generally in the human condition, and they're able to laugh at circumstances in order to live another day. For example, might say to themselves when they do something wrong, well, that was a dumb thing to do. Now, how can I repair it? So they are survivors, and they empathize with other people. They're able to see things from other people's point of view. And they have a tendency to tell stories about themselves, humorous stories. So they don't take themselves too seriously. And those are the key elements for what we find of resilient people. Now, do they develop that, or do they learn that over one day? No, it takes time and it takes practice. So what we see is that I can do a lot more to become more resilient. Changing my thoughts, what do I tell myself? And much of our conversation during the course of the day is with ourselves. Many times we set ourselves up for failure by what we say to ourselves, where we're constantly criticizing ourselves, for example, instead of looking at what are some of the positive things that we've done and what are the things that I should have some gratitude for. So you want to change how you speak to yourself and how you appear to yourself. Take time to consider what the possible alternatives might be. So in dealing with people and change, we really have three different categories. We have the uninformed, we have the unable, and we have the unwilling. In dealing with the resistance that many have, first thing is to listen to them. This has been the single biggest thing that I've come across, for example, in all of the changes that I've seen and that I've worked organizations through. And what I have found is that when there is a change taking place, we are very quick to try to convince everybody else, as opposed to listening to what their perception is. How do they see the change? What is their reaction to the change? Where are they coming from? What is it that concerns them? Until we deal with that aspect of it, typically we're not going to get people to move towards change. Other people we need to educate, so we're going to provide them with information and training, for example, can help them. We want to communicate consistently. This is another difficulty. I think one of the things that was brought out early on in our poll focused on the issue of communication. And what frequently happens is people get information from many different sources when there's an organizational change occurring. And what typically happens as a result is that they're getting a lot of misinformation. And many times, unfortunately, managers have contributed to this because they filter some of the information that comes down to them. And they give their twist on that information as opposed to being consistent in the information that they are providing. Bargaining, working deals with people, in other words, trade-offs, for example, can oftentimes help deal with resistance. Another approach, get them involved. Give them a role. Get them involved on the team that's instituting the change, for example, in the organization. So they have a role, they have a piece of the change, so to speak. And then lastly, give them a choice. And sometimes that's what ends up happening after all is said and done. They have to make a choice as to whether they want to stay with what the change is, or are they going to have to look perhaps for a new position somewhere, unfortunately. Now there's another group who we might describe as the unwilling. They act as devil's advocate, and they prevent groupthink. And the way that they do that is by challenging us and asking a lot of questions. Well, why are we doing this? And how is it going to be done? And what will it do? So what they're really doing is they're acting as reality testers. And frequently what we find is that the unwilling really help us to define and refine the change as we're moving along. So we don't want to be too quick in turning people off, even if they are described as the unwilling. They can be very helpful to us. So some best practices in instituting change. First, we would say have a clear articulated vision. Why are we changing? What is the purpose of it? What is it going to help us to achieve? And this needs to be relatively clear and simple, but it needs to be something that we can communicate and that we can get other people to buy into. We may have a great vision, but if we don't get buy-in on it, it's not going to move very far. Next is alignment. In other words, getting people to march in the same direction. And that means providing incentives and rewards for those who jump on board and get in and follow the leader, so to speak. Next, continued focus. I've worked with many different organizations over a period of the last 25, 30 years. And one of the things that I oftentimes find occurs as far as the leadership is concerned, they don't maintain a continued focus. We get started on a change, and then all of a sudden they look at another priority and they gravitate to the other priority, and the change priority has gone by the board. So they lose focus, and as a result the organization loses focus on the change. Next, of course, employee involvement, which we just described, and the importance of getting people on board and keeping them informed in a consistent fashion. And that means having an organization within your organization that's going to communicate information consistently to employees so they know what is happening and how well the change is going, both the good and the bad. Next is reinforcement. When we see people instituting the change, using the new behaviors that are described as part of the change, performing differently, we want to reinforce it. So we want to reward them. And it can be a verbal reward or it could be a financial reward. And lastly, institutionalization. And this is where many organizations tend to fall down, because they don't institutionalize it. Now, what I mean by that is they make it part of that organization, and you do that by incorporating it into the performance management, performance appraisal system. So people are held accountable for the change and ensuring that it is being carried out effectively. During this time, we have to deal with some defensive behavior, and these are some techniques that you might find helpful. Using questions, paraphrasing. At times, it can be very effective to use silence and simply listen to the person. And this encourages them to continue speaking. Another technique is role reversal. How would you feel if you were in my shoes? So it helps them to look at things from somebody else's point of view as opposed to their own. And of course, neutral responses, things like a nod of the head, yes, similar responses, and show that you're listening, and it encourages them to speak. So, productive change guidelines: be a leader, take charge, and take ownership. You're part of it if you are a manager. That's your responsibility. That's your part of the ownership. Plan and rehearse your communications. Many times people rely upon knee-jerk kind of responses as opposed to sitting down and figuring out, okay, how am I going to communicate this information effectively and clearly to the people that work for me? So it's a good idea at times to rehearse your communications before communicating. Next, communicate armed with facts, not rumors. Oh, where do you get the facts? Well, you've got to go to your management, for example, oftentimes, and get the information. What do you want me to communicate, boss? Getting a lot of questions from folks in terms of, where do we go from here? What can you tell me? Other thing to do is to continue to focus on goals and objectives. Maintain productivity. In other words, keep people focused. Oftentimes, when change takes place over a long period of time, we find, for example, that people are dealing with that ambiguity and they get very upset. So whatever you can do to help keep them focused on their work and on getting the job done, the better off they're going to be. So you continue to set challenging, motivating, and realistic standards with them and require them to perform. Okay, listen for feedback and resistance. Get out of your office. One of the big things I oftentimes run into is middle managers in particular in large organizations have a tendency to hide in their offices when there's a big change, I should say, taking place. Because oftentimes they don't have any information to communicate to employees. And so what they do is they restrict their contact with employees. Address small problems when they are small. Keep them that way. Don't try to be all things to all people. You can't be. And remember to maintain that optimistic outlook. You can have a significant impact. And lastly, don't take life too seriously, because none of us get out of it alive. And here are just some quotes that you might find interesting. You must do the thing you think you cannot do. That's what Eleanor Roosevelt said. And Wayne Gretzky, the great hockey player, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Henry Ford, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And one of the reasons people stop learning is that they become less and less willing to risk failure. John Gardner from Common Cause passed away a number of years ago. So Julie, I'd be willing to take any questions that I brought up.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Paul. That was a great presentation. There's a lot of information in there. So everybody, if you have a question, I haven't gotten questions so far because I think we were all listening pretty intently. So please feel free to send in your questions now. Did you want me to run this last poll? I know we have one here just to see how everybody is feeling about the extent at which they are dealing with the stress.
Yeah, let's have that last poll.
Yeah, I think that'll give us some insight. So, and here we go. Everybody who's still with us here, go ahead and take this poll. We want to see what extent you feel you've been effective in dealing with stress. If you've not been effective at all, if you're somewhat, moderately, very, or extremely. Thank you, everybody, for voting. That's great. Okay, I'm going to close it up and share. Let's see how everybody else is feeling. So 3% don't feel they're effective at all in dealing with stress. 24% feel they're somewhat effective. 50% feel they're moderately effective. 24% are very effective. And 0% are extremely effective.
Well, I think one of the things that, for those of you that are dealing with the issue of stress, one of the things that you might want to take a look at is a book that came out a few years ago that's called The Relaxation Response. And what it would help you to do is to focus upon some different kinds of techniques that would help you to reduce the amount of stress that you have. But I would go back to those suggestions that we made before because some of those can be very helpful. Remember your breathing, remember the caffeine, remember the sugared drinks, for example. And on the other hand, if you happen to be a middle manager, you might find it helpful to sit down and talk with your boss about your position. And what are some of the key things in your job, for example, that perhaps were nice to do a few years ago, but you don't have the resources to do them at this point. And you might find that to be a helpful conversation, obviously depending upon how well you get along with your boss. So much depends upon that relationship. But I would encourage you to try to cut down on the amount of stress, basically, that you are feeling, and use some of those exercises, for example, and getting enough exercise, even walking, for example, as we've seen in recent weeks. They've been making a number of reports on simply walking vigorously for about 20 minutes every day and how much it can improve people's blood pressure, for example. So if I can be of any help, please feel free to contact me. My information is located on that final slide in applied psychology, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. My telephone number is on there, or you can email me.
All right. Oh, great.
Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I need you to repeat the name of the book for our listeners that you just said.
Certainly. It's called The Relaxation Response.
Okay.
All right. Now, let me just mention, too, Julie, one of the other things that oftentimes happens is people don't manage their time effectively, and that can increase stress. So they may want to take a look at some time management books or articles that are out there today.
Great suggestions. I do have a question here. What advice do you have for folks who aren't managers but who want to be a positive part of the change?
Well, I think one of the things to do in that situation is to actually volunteer to work on any committees or any task forces, for example, that are available in the organization. If you're solidly behind a particular initiative that has been developed, then I would encourage you to indicate your support for it. They may be able to use you on the task force, or they may have some special assignments for you to do where you can demonstrate that willingness and your confidence in what that initiative happens to be.
That's a great suggestion. I'm thinking to stay out of the rumor mill, too, maybe for those people.
Oh, yes, indeed. Stay away from the rumor mill.
The other book that you mentioned in the slides, was it Learned Optimism?
It's Learned Optimism.
Okay. Do you know the author of that?
Yes, that's Martin Seligman, Seligman.
All right, great.
And it's part of what they call today positive psychology.
Great. Okay. Oh, somebody chimed in and said it's readily available on Amazon.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Correct.
Okay.
Thanks for the message on that.
Awesome. Good. Well, I wanted to let everyone know that the recording of this webinar will be on our website in a day or two. So I'm sure if you email Dr. Maloney individually with your questions about the slides that he has put together, that he will respond to you. I don't think we're getting the slides out there to everybody, but you have plenty of opportunity to see them through the recording or contact Dr. Maloney specifically. Does that sound good, Paul?
That sounds good.
Okay. Excellent.
Sounds fine, Julie.
All right, good. All right, so if there's any more questions from anybody, you got another shot here. Otherwise, I want to thank you so much for sharing all this information with us in this, especially since it's January and we're all going through, the getting into our new year, and change is going to happen no matter what. So thanks for all of these tips and advice on how to deal with it. And we really hope you'll come back next year with another great topic. Thank you for always helping us.
Well, thank you very much, Julie. I enjoyed doing it, and I'll be happy to handle the questions as they come along. So,
all right, great.
People should not be hesitant.
Great. And everybody that joined us today, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to be on this webinar, and I hope you took something from it. We have a survey that will be coming to you when you leave the webinar, so please fill it out and let us know any of your thoughts and any ideas for future webinars. And we do have our next webinar, which will be February 17th at 1 o'clock, and that's going to be about turning your outdated resume into a valuable marketing tool. So that one should be a great one. We've had a lot of requests for a resume workshop, so we do read your feedback and we do try to react quickly. So that will be February 17th. Following that in March, we'll have Jennifer Lee Magus back with us to continue her talk on getting your elevator speech together and personal branding. And following that, on April 21st, we will have Claire Chandler back talking about getting noticed and the power of employee recognition. So thanks again, everybody. Please have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you again in February. Take care. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Julie.
Okay.
Thanks for all your help.
All right, great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.